Good morning, everyone. Welcome to today's webinar. I have the pleasure of being here with Stephen. Thank you so much for being here today. Today, we're going to go over a big topic, which has to do with reserves, what's going on. There's a lot of legislation that's being at the moment talked about and being proposed. Today's webinar, we're going to go over some of that. We're also going to go over what are the fiduciary responsibility of board members and how that works with reserves. We're going to get started in just about a minute. We have a pretty large crowd that's attending today's webinar, so we want to give everyone the opportunity to be able to log in before we start the formal introductions. For those of you that are here for the first time, welcome. We do have a Q&A. It's either going to be at the bottom of your screen or on the top of your screen. Feel free to ask any questions that are related to reserves or fiduciary duties of a board member. Stephen and myself will do our best to get to those questions. If we're unable to get to those questions, please don't hesitate to reach out to either Stephen, myself, Katie, or Ashley, and we'll do our best to be able to help you if we're not able to address those concerns on today's webinar. Again, thank you all for being here today. We're going to go over reserves, what it's being proposed by legislators, as well as fiduciary responsibility of board members. So with further ado, I think, Stephen, if you don't mind starting off with a little bit of an introduction on yourself and the firm that you represent.
Sure. Thank you, Raphael. My name is Steve Brayton. I'm the shareholder with Rosenbaum PLLC, overseeing the association practice group here. I'm in my 28th year of practice. I've been representing community associations, plan unit developments, both from the owner control side, as well as worked in-house counsel for a large real estate developer on the west coast of Florida. And I've served on boards of directors, including my own homeowners association. I drew the short straw. So I do feel, board members' pain. I've been there. At one point in time, I had a CAM license and qualified a condominium hotel on Marco Island. So have had a lot of on the ground experience, as well as, obviously from the legal perspective. So very happy to be here, and thank you for having us.
All right. Thank you, Stephen. It's always a pleasure to be along your side doing these webinars. So I thank you for being here today. As for myself, my name is Raphael Aquino. I am the CEO and co-founder of Affinity Management Services. We are a community association management company with a core focus of really managing associations throughout Dade, Broward, and Palm Beach. Our sweet spot are properties that have an on-site team or an on-site manager, I guess I should say, and those boards that are really looking for a little bit more of a personal touch and don't want to feel like just a number within an organization. We're more of that kind of boutique style operation. But enough about us. I think our listeners are here to learn a little bit more about reserves. There's so much going on right now, especially with what's being discussed in Tallahassee. There's many changes that are being proposed. But before we kick it off there, I guess maybe, Stephen, if you can give a little bit of an explanation of, reserve funding, calculations, and some of the requirements that are required or not required when it comes to HOAs and condos.
Sure. So at the moment, condominiums are more heavily regulated when it comes to reserves, and so are co-ops versus homeowners associations. Statute is significantly different for homeowners associations compared to condos and co-ops. And condo and co-op land, there are certain specific required reserve accounts that the association must have, such as paving, roof, and building painting, and any other component where the cost of deferred maintenance or replacement is $10,000 or more. And in condo and co-ops, the association board is required to adopt a budget every year that shows the full funding of reserves. Okay. And with respect to homeowners associations, statute is a little different. It was actually just recently amended in July of 2021, which was a developer funded bill, which allows developers to avoid funding reserves during the developer control period And whether or not a homeowners association has what we call statutory reserves, similar to what I just was describing with condos and co-ops, depends on whether the members have voted to make their reserve accounts protected by statute. The threshold for what's considered a reserve item is the same in terms of dollar amount, but there are no mandatory reserve accounts the same way we have for condos and co-ops. So one of the things we may see down the road is a change there to the HOA statute. But in terms of funding reserves and figuring out whether or not you're fully funding reserves, that requires expert analysis. That requires the associations to hire a professional to perform those calculations and tell the board where they are in terms of what they have on account and where they need to be. And then we can talk a little bit later in the presentation about the different ways to fund reserves, because there's a couple of different ways that can be done. So.
Yeah, perfect. Thank you. And I know, as we were discussing prior to logging on to the webinar, Stephen, it's crazy to think that Florida is one of the only states. I recently took a class by one of the industry experts in association reserves, and they were giving us some statistics throughout the country. And Florida is one of the only states that actually permits the waiving of reserves. And after the tragedy that occurred at Surfside, again, there's a lot going on in Tallahassee right now. There's a lot of bills being proposed. Some of those bills are proposing, or I should say, some of the recommendations were proposing a minimum of 50% reserve. So change is definitely coming to our industry. And as we were discussing before, it's really the responsibility of board members and managers alike to start communicating to their boards of what the challenges that may arise. Now, this may not apply to all associations, but it's going to apply to a majority, because from my experience, I know we see most associations aren't properly funded. They don't have the proper funds necessary to do the repairs that are required within their association. So we've been saying it for some time, things are going to probably get a little bit more expensive in the condo world between reserves and the increases in insurance. But again, we're not trying to fearmonger here. We're just really trying to educate, let you know what's going on so that you and your boards can prepare. So you mentioned a little bit about reserves funding. There's also different ways that associations have managed to deal without reserves. Stephen, maybe if you could talk a little bit about what are some of the good and bad special assessments, and something when it comes to like loans versus fully funded reserves. If you can give maybe a little bit of your experience when it comes to that.
Well, it's always better to have the reserves funded rather than to have to take a loan to fund a major improvement project, such as, for example, concrete restoration for a high-rise condominium. And those projects are very expensive. And when you have to borrow those funds, the underwriting requirements are strict. Obviously you're paying an interest rate. Those interest rates are low for the time being, but we certainly expect that to change in the next couple of years as well. So when lenders look at an association, when buyers look at an association, and buyers are getting more sophisticated, by the day, they're looking to see what the current funding is by the association, because they want to know, am I going to get hit with a special assessment? Mm-hmm. When you borrow funds to fund a project, the bank is going to expect you to levy an assessment to repay that loan.
Correct.
So either way, you're going to have to impose some type of an assessment to fund the project. So while you may borrow the monies up front, and there may be, a period of time to repay that, and at the end of the day, how much are you as an owner going to pay versus if I sell my unit down the road and it's a long-term loan, is the next guy going to have to pay some of that loan? Yeah, those are things that go into the analysis, and people have gotten, comfortable with cheap money being available and say, hey, why should I fund reserves when, I can borrow the money at low rates, and maybe somebody else is going to pay back that loan because I don't know how long I'm going to live there. That's certainly one approach we've seen our clients take. But I think that trend is going to slow. And I think associations, whether it's because of the legislature or because of, as we were talking before we went live, lender underwriting requirements to buy a property is going to force the issue. And so I think what associations need to prepare for is that the days of waiving reserves are either going to go by the wayside, or they're going to get a whole lot harder to do. And there may be certain reserve components that the legislature carves out and says, you can't waive as to this. You know, you may be able to waive as to certain items, but you're not going to be able to waive as to other items. So I think that's really the direction we're headed. And as you pointed out, we're one of the few states that even allows the waiving of reserves in the country. So that doesn't look good, you know, for politicians up in Tallahassee. So they've got to answer for that.
Correct. And I'm hopeful that there are, you know, there is, I should say, change coming. And as you stated, when it comes to, you know, obtaining these loans for associations that don't have the proper reserves, you know, they, as you said, you know, they found it, okay, it's cheaper to be able to borrow. But what I have found is that when you get yourself into that situation, what most associations fall into is most loans are probably going to be anywhere between 5 to 7 years, depending on what the repair you're going to need to do. And then once they have that loan, you know, you have a special assessment you're paying for, you have your budget you're paying for. A loan is never enough to be able to fix all the things that are necessary within that 5 to 7 year span. It's just too much. Then they constantly fall into having to get another loan after 7 years, because most buildings need to be restored or painted, and on average is about 7 to 10 years. And you're finding yourself in this vicious cycle, and you're not really able to address all the components within the building, because you can only borrow so much, because there's underwriting factors that they have within their loans of how much they can lend you based on your current maintenance fees. So, you know, with what's being potentially proposed, I know one of the reports that were provided by the grand jury was that having a minimum of 50% reserves, and then that other difference they could potentially waive, but have a special assessment for it. You know, that at least puts association in a much better position, because if you have the money, most boards are going to do the right thing and fix what they need to fix. Where it becomes challenging is when they don't have the money. And then, you know, they're in a position where, okay, do I pass a special assessment? What are people going to say? How are they going to react? And you find yourself in this situation where you're the enemy in its own way. So I think if we can get a bill that at least requires and gives associations a time frame to at least get partially funded reserves in place, it's going to make everyone's life easier. Attorneys, managers, board members, and things will get done, and we can avoid, you know, putting our board members in these kinds of situations. Now, I know we've spoken a little bit about what's being proposed. So maybe, Stephen, if you can kind of chime in on some of the bills. I know that there's a lot of different things being proposed by different legislators, but maybe on the high level ones of what you believe could potentially impact our associations.
Sure. So there's two bills that have already been pre-introduced by a couple of representatives in Tallahassee, and we're looking at a couple of different, you know, scenarios, and you know, it's way early in the process. Mm-hmm. So what gets proposed on the front end and what actually gets passed are usually two very different things, but we certainly expect some form of legislation to go through that's going to require mandatory inspections of residential condominiums, co-ops and homeowners association buildings of 4 stories or more that are within 1/2 mile of the coast. So if you're located within 1/2 mile of the coast, you can expect a mandatory inspection requirement if you're 30 years of age, if your building's 30 years old, okay? And possibly, I know they were talking about 25 years. And then re-inspections every 5 years after that. You know, there's possibly maybe earlier re-inspections. And then there may be some mandatory components that have to be inspected. One of the things they're talking about is mandating 18 specific components of the property, which I guess has been identified as the most high-risk components of the property. And, you know, then we're getting into some legislation here that talks about mandatory reporting to the local government agencies. So like, for example, in Palm Beach County, we saw letters get fired out from the fire department and building and zoning to all condominium associations that were at least 25 years of age, and, you know, telling them to get inspections and then to share those inspection reports with the county, and that was not mandatory. But this is going to create a whole nother level of bureaucracy in terms of who's reviewing these reports. Our building's going to get cited if these reports come back. It's definitely serious business in terms of the legislation mandating architects or engineers to perform these types of inspections. And then of course, in addition to the structural side, there's the electrical side, which also presents a life safety issue. So there's going to be mandatory inspections there, most likely. I know a lot of associations, a lot of our clients were proactive, and after, the tragedy in Surfside, they went out and got engineers to come out and inspect their buildings and, try to get ahead of the curve. But others have not. And so they're going to have to. In terms of, the reserve items that we were talking about earlier, some of these bills are going to provide perhaps enhanced measures with respect to renovation of parking garages and swimming pool decks. So again, we're looking at areas of the building that may be subject to collapse, which if that collapses, the rest of the building goes.
Yeah.
Roof, I know, insurance is driving a lot of these things as well. I'm sure a lot of our attendees have experienced increased insurance rates because if they have an old roof on their building, that's going to be a problem. So all of these things are going to probably need to be looked at. They're going to be required to be looked at. And we may also see mandatory reserves back in the statutes where associations have to have reserve studies every 3 years or every 2 years. So, it really, we expect some significant changes in the law, as a result of all this. And it's just a matter of how much.
Correct. And the truth is that, they're doing their part. And I believe what they're doing, it's what's right, in my opinion. But we'll see what ends up coming about, and we won't know for about another 60 to 70 days of what's actually going to come together. However, there is another factor that, you and I were speaking offline, Stephen, is it has to do with Freddie and Fannie. They're having certain requirements of associations now in order to be able to lend to associations. So Freddie and Fannie are one of the biggest lenders within the world of lending to homeowners to buying their first home and so forth. So right now, we just heard that they're going to require a reserve study, and the reserve study needs to be updated within the past 36 months. They're going to increase their requirements for delinquencies. So there's a lot of changes, whether our legislators make the change that's necessary for our associations. There's other forces that are playing into this that board members and managers need to be aware of. Because if you're not, again, you're going to be caught in a very difficult situation. One of the things that we're doing, at least from a management side, is preparing our clients. We're about to do a blast now to all our board members, I would say in about the next week. We negotiated better reserve study rates, in a bulk rate where they'll get maybe 10 to 15% off on the reserve study, because what we're trying to prepare is similar to what happened after Surfside. Engineers were bombarded. Now try to negotiate a construction contract or an engineering contract. It's impossible. No one wants to negotiate. The demand is there. They're overwhelmed. So, what we're trying to do is trying to be proactive and let our clients know, listen, if you don't have a reserve study, now's the time to get the reserve study. It's normally reserve specialist slow season, the first quarter of the year. So it's important that you're getting ahead of it. Whether if the law passes or not, it doesn't hurt to at least know what the total cost to have what the total cost is to be able to really properly maintain your association.
That's, you make some great points there. And I think what sometimes gets lost in the discussion is the statute as it already stands, especially in condominium and co-ops, is the board is already supposed to be adopting a budget, fully funding reserves. And the question I always get asked is, well, how do we know if we're, fully funded, So really, even though they took out the requirement to have reserves done every 3 years some time ago from the statute, there was still this need to understand, are we fully funding or not? And way we got around that was we'll just put the vote to the owners to waive or partially fund, so we don't need to worry about it. And I think that piece is going to go away in some fashion or another. And so, to your point, get the reserve study now rather than, come July when laws go into effect and everybody's scrambling next budget season, to get a reserve at the same time, and you won't have vendors available. I think that's an excellent point.
Correct. Yeah. I mean, and as you mentioned, Stephen, they're making requirements, and it will get more bureaucratic. They're making requirements as to who can do it. So it's important that you're dealing with, either someone that, in my recommendation, would be a company that has an engineer if they're doing a reserve study. And in some cases, there's even certification through CAI that they're considered a reserve specialist, where they deal specifically with our industry, and they know how to be able to, properly give you the number. The number is not always 100% precise, because obviously we see what's going on with inflation, but it gives you a ballpark figure. The way I like to, express it to our clients is, it gives you an opportunity, a tool where you can communicate with your residents and at least let them know where you are, whether the situation is good or bad. It's important to let your membership know where you stand, because if you don't, the day is going to come, if you're in a bad predicament, and you're going to find yourself in a much more difficult situation of having to deal with, upset homeowners when you're asking for double what their maintenance fees are, rather than just communicating it ahead of time. So we spoke a little bit about, membership having the opportunity of waiving it. Could you tell me, are there any, from a legal side, is there any liability, to the residents or to the homeowners if they waive these kinds of reserves?
Well, if you're following the statutory process to waive reserves, I don't think there's a liability from that perspective. I think the liability comes from the duty of the association and the board to maintain and protect, the common property, whether we're talking about the common elements of a condominium, or we're talking about, association property or common area in a homeowner association. So, we can waive reserves all day long, but we can't allow, the common components to fall apart.
Yeah.
So one way or another, we've got to fund those repairs. And so, to your point, and my phrase I typically use in seminars that I teach on budgeting is, you can only kick the can down the road so far. And at some point, the tire is going to meet the road, and you've got to make the repairs. So I think the days of, focusing on the short term are over. Having a long-term, strategic plan of how you're going to finance projects, 5 years down the road, 10 years down the road, we need to start having that longer term view of our community components. And as you said, if we plan properly, the hit to the owners won't be a one-time hit. It'll be a gradual thing that owners will be paying. And the thing that I think gets lost in the shuffle here, because we're focused on how much am I paying out of my pocket today, is the other side of it, which is, how much am I increasing the value of my investment in my unit or my home by having these reserves funded or having done these projects. I mean, I had, a client where they went through a very controversial special assessment to have to do a concrete restoration project that had been put off for quite a long time. And also updating the windows and doors in the condominium project, where some of the windows and doors were, 45 years old, original windows and doors. And now those units are worth 40% more than what they were before the project. So, you may have to put in, on the front end, but you get it back on the appreciated value, hopefully on your unit. It's not necessarily a one-to-one, but it's certainly, it's going to show, because as I said before, the buyers are more sophisticated. The lenders aren't going to get burned again. All those mortgage loans that were on those units in Surfside where they took a bath, that's why we're seeing these questionnaires and requirements coming out of Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac, because they're the ones that, secured those loans. And so they ultimately took the hit. So we're always going to see the private sector react quicker than government.
Right.
And they're going to force the issue, whether government legislation does it or not. So,
Correct. Yeah, and I mean, at the end of the day, they have to protect their bottom line as well. So I have a question here that I think it relates to where we're at in our conversation. It's from Bob, and Bob asks, "What changes will affect HOAs?"
yeah, I'm not sure we're seeing a whole lot of focus on that side of it in the legislature because, the Champlain Towers were, condominiums. So it seems as though right now the focus is on the condominium and perhaps the co-op side versus the HOA side. So I'm not sure we're going to see a whole lot of change to mandatory reserve funding and homeowners associations, perhaps unless they're located very close to the coastline, as I was saying before. That said, the associations have to have, HOAs have to have certain disclaimers on their budget and their financial statements. If they're not funding reserves, the statute provides for a specific disclosure. It has to be in all caps. It has to be in a font larger than the rest of the budget or financial statements. And it's basically saying, to the owners, hey, you could be looking at a special assessment because we're not fully funding, the replacement of deferred maintenance or capital expenditure items. So I'm not sure we're going to see a lot of change on the HOA side, but it's still, again, something the boards have an obligation to look at, and I still recommend, having a reserve study done, at least every 3 years, if not then maybe every 5 years. And then also making sure you get quality appraisals of your components, because you've got to insure those components.
Yep.
They're underinsured. It's been a long time since South Florida has been hit by a hurricane. So it's going to happen. It's not a matter if, it's just a matter when. And if you're underinsured from a value standpoint, you're going to take a big hit if you have to make a claim. So.
Correct. And those are great points that you're bringing up. And it's important also to keep in mind is to understand what your current position is. Remember, boards, if you're on a board, you don't necessarily have to give, I take it back. You don't have to give the option to waive the reserves. As a board, you could decide that you want to fund the reserves and you have that right. You don't have to put it up for a membership vote. So by having a reserve study, you could present that, explain to your residents why you're looking to do what you need to do. Obviously, it's probably going to be challenging if you go from having no reserves to all of a sudden having fully funding reserves. But as a board, you do have that right. Now, if you're going to do partially, then obviously you have to put that vote up for a membership. But either way, you could decide, okay, I'm going to present a budget with fully funded, and we're going to give an option just to partially fund it and not completely eliminate it. So do keep that in mind. And just as an exercise, I would say for those managers and board members that are attending today is, just start off with some of the basics. If you don't have reserve studies, just try to find out what's your liquidity, what's your current position. Because many times you'll be surprised, those associations that don't have reserves, that's in some cases, they don't even have some of the basics of 2 months or 3 months of what their budget is in their operating account. Just that, understanding your liquidity position, understanding, as Stephen mentioned, if a hurricane hits, what's the impact that's going to be to your association? If you have no reserves, you have a deductible that you're going to need to pay for. What's that deductible? How is that going to impact your residents? And then that way you're communicating to the ownership and letting them know, look, this is the situation that we have. The past is the past. What can we do to move forward? Because number one, we saw what occurred, unfortunately, at Surfside. We haven't been hit by a hurricane, but it's only a matter of time. And, how can we properly, or how can we prepare for this? So, we need to be prepared for that. So when it comes to, you mentioned insurance, Stephen, I know we've experienced the cost of insurance have skyrocketed, especially for those properties in the coastal side. What have you seen, at least from your clients? Have you seen, because we've seen increases as high as 60-70% on those coastal towns, the ones that are more inland, 10 to 25%. But,
right.
I'm not sure if you've seen the same thing from your clients.
No, absolutely. Definitely have been seeing the same thing. Also, one of the things I've heard from, insurance agents that we work with on a regular basis with common clients is that umbrella policies not be available at all. And that a lot of the carriers that were writing umbrella insurance in Florida have pulled out. So if you were used to having a $15 or $25 million umbrella insurance that you didn't pay a significant amount for, you may not even be able to get that coverage. So, that's a significant issue because, as you know, with certain properties, if you've got, a common area pool, God forbid, there's a drowning or something that happens and you don't have that type of insurance, it's, it could become an imposed assessment against the members. If an owner, if somebody gets a judgment against the association because of some negligence on the part of the association. So, definitely some scary trends in the insurance market that I'm not seeing a whole lot of talk about yet, but I imagine that's something the legislature is going to have to address because, Citizens is a state-funded insurance program that's the insurance of last resort. And so, there was years where they were, trying to offboard policies, and now it's going the other direction again. So that's going to be a problem, I think, that they're going to have to deal with in Tallahassee.
Yeah, no, and insurance companies are also getting much smarter. Before it was just be, general form, fill this out. Now they're asking much more questions. They want to understand, what's been being done with maintenance. They're even sending individuals out to inspect the property in a little bit more detail than before. Before, in my experience, has been more safety kind of concerns in the sense of, are there trip hazards? Are the proper pool equipment items, like your shepherd hook and so forth. But now they're paying much more attention when it comes to the structure, the roof, the components, and the assets. So it's important to keep that in mind because you need to make sure that, you're doing the preventative maintenance that's necessary for your building. Have you seen from your clients where they're having any challenges getting insured because, they're not doing the necessary maintenance to the building?
Yeah, I haven't heard any client call me and say we haven't been able to obtain insurance at all. I think it's just going to become a question of, how much are they paying? And if you're at a point where, no carrier will write for you, then you're in trouble because that must mean your building is in such bad shape that it's been neglected for many years, which, brings about other serious concerns. So, and the savings that will result from these projects being done on a timely basis and being funded, is something, we didn't talk about up front, but, it makes sense that you're going to save on insurance premiums if you're proactive in maintaining the buildings and structures. So.
Okay, excellent. I have a good question here from a gentleman named Mark. He asked, can an association propose the approval of partial reserves? And is there any amount or percentage required?
So one more time, let me hear that one more time.
Yeah, sure. So the question is basically, can the board propose partial reserves? And if so, is there like a particular percentage or amount that should be proposed?
Yeah, no, well, the board can propose, funding reserves on a partial basis. And as far as a percentage, it absolutely can decide what percentage to propose, whether it's 50%, 75%, or something in between. The association needs to work with their legal counsel to draft the proxy, because it's usually done by a proxy vote, limited proxy vote, so that, however you want to present it is properly phrased. And you may even want to specify the dollar amount of funding that the members are voting to fund for that particular year. And I think one thing to point out is when we look at this issue about, partially funding or waiving reserves, the vote on that issue is only good for that year. It's something that you have to visit year over year. So it's something, again, my suggestion would be is, getting that reserve study, looking at where you're at, and coming up with a plan that, focuses on the next X number of years to get you where you're at 100% funding without, raising assessments in a way that's going to cause a huge financial burden on the membership on the front end. We want to, phase it in to the best we can. And the sooner we do that, the better off we will be, before we have no choice but to levy those increased assessments because they become a mandate, by the legislature.
Correct. You brought up exactly what I wanted to bring up, which again, we want to stress that importance of the reserve study. As Steven said, you want to understand first what's your current situation, and by having a reserve study, it'll give you a ballpark idea of what components you have that may be going down within the next couple of years. Depending on the age of your building, you have elevators, you have roofs. Those are the big components. You also have very smaller components that have costs associated to them. Pool pumps. There's a lot of different components within the building depending on how on your structure itself. That you want to know prior to just saying, okay, we're just going to do 10% because that's what we believe is common to save. You want to kind of fully assess what's going on. Also understand, are there any projects that you have coming on in the near future? If you do have any projects, you want to make sure that you're factoring that into your number. My recommendation is always, let's be as transparent as we can with the ownership. Again, the good and the bad. And that way, when you have to cross that bridge, everyone is well aware of why you're having to cross that bridge because you've communicated those challenges to your membership. I do have some other great questions here that I want to get into. I think it's maybe a good time now. Edward asked, can you discuss the difference between pooled reserves and the straight line reserves?
Sure. No, that's a great question. So let me take straight line reserves first. So straight line reserves are when you look at each component of your property and you determine the useful life of that component and the remaining useful life and how much it's going to cost to replace that component at the end of its estimated useful life. And you're funding for that replacement cost as to that item. Okay. And then you're doing that for each item that you're required to reserve for by statute. Now, a pooled reserve is where you take all those items that you're required to reserve for, put it in one bucket, and then you have what's called a cash flow analysis. So the reserve specialist will calculate each year during the life cycle of the components in that bucket, what monies you'll be having coming in from the funding of the reserves and what monies you will have coming out in that particular year. And the money in the pool can be used for any component in the pool. So let's say, for example, we miscalculated on one of the particular items in the pool. We can use the money in the pool to fix that item. Now, if we're on a straight line and we miscalculated the useful life of that component and we don't have enough money in the account for that line item, then we have to go to the membership and get a vote to authorize the use of funds from a different reserve account item to pay for the one we underestimated. Or we got to levy a special assessment to make up the shortfall in that specific account. So pooled reserves gives you greater flexibility on managing your reserve and deferred expenses. And also it tends to get you to the same place that you need to be when you do a straight line method, but the annual assessment to fund the pool tends to be a little bit lower. So those are the basics on pooled and straight line reserves. And I do want to mention before I forget that the Department of Business and Professional Regulation Division of Florida Condominiums has a self-study training manual on budgets and reserve schedules. It's a great resource. It's online. You need to go to the Division of Florida Condominiums under the myflorida.com website, and you can download that manual, and it gives you a lot of great tips. It gives you a lot of examples. It gives you sample budgets. It gives you sample reserve schedules. It's a great tool, and I keep it close at hand at my desk. So,
yeah, that is a great tool. So, I have a question here from Tom, and Tom asked, they have a reserve study, but the board have presented about half the required amount. What action can be taken to reflect the truly fully funding of reserves?
Well, again, it depends on what the board did and whether or not they got the proper vote to fund reserves at 50% of the amount the reserve study called for. And if they didn't, then the owners may have certain recourse with the department if it's a condominium or a
Yeah.
co.
And I would advise that owner as well that keep in mind that that is official records of the association. So if you want to know what the actual figure is, just do a records request, and management or your manager or the board of directors should provide you that information. And also keep in mind, maybe you don't want to hear this, but you can also run for the board if you're not happy with the decisions your current board is making. So if you feel that there's a different approach, then that may be opportunity or your time to really step in, or vice versa, to support the board of directors and say, hey, look, I'd like to be part of the finance committee or whatever committee to be able to assist and present to the board a better direction, or what I believe would be a better direction for the community as a whole. Remember, your boards are volunteers, so they're doing their best. So if they can get additional support, I'm sure in most cases, most boards will take that help. I know from a management side, when we get asked for that help, we definitely take it because we can do more with more people assisting within the association. I have a question here from Sharon, and Sharon asks, can the HOA board move more money each year into reserves, even though it has been approved for the budget? So basically moving, if they have, I guess, an excess of funds, is it okay for them just to move that into the reserves?
Right. Typically, the answer to that question is yes. I would certainly check and have your legal counsel check the association documents, governing documents, to make sure that they're, the association board has that authority. But typically that's something that you can do.
Yeah, that's definitely a great problem to have.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, that's really next year when you do your budget, just move those funds into the reserve and keep it simple. And, that's definitely a good problem to have, not a common problem, but a really good problem to have. So I want to stick. I'm sorry, you were going to say something, Steve?
Yeah, just real quick while I'm thinking of it on the topic of HOAs and reserves. Sometimes the requirement to fund reserves is in the documents. So, I saw one of the questions about where does it say in the statute, about waiving reserves or not waiving reserves. And it may be that your governing documents mandate the funding of reserves if you're a homeowners association. So I don't want to lose sight of that point. And that's something that any HOA board should always check with their legal counsel and CPA to see whether the documents require. So there may not be a waiver option, because if there's mandatory funding requirement in the documents, you got to do it.
Yeah, that's an excellent point. I have a question here that I'll take on from Patricia. And Patricia asked, we have a reserve study that was done in 2018. Is there a rule or a statute that mandates when it should be updated? Common in our industry, it's known about every 36 months is when you should update it. So yours has been just about 4 years. So you're just around that time. What I recommend, as I stated earlier, is try to get that proposal now and try to get that started now. Because the busiest time of year for anyone that has that does reserves is normally that second quarter on throughout the year, because some people order it in order to do their budgets. But costs have significantly gone up probably since 2008. So you want to get an update. And for those that may have the question, is the update the same price as a full reserves? From my experience, there's a significant drop in the price because the information and the data is already there. What they're doing at that time is just taking a look at the useful life, and then also taking a look at any increase in cost for the repairs of those items. So usually you're going to find a significant drop from your first time doing a reserve study to getting an update. In reality, also, the cost is very, very, very minimal compared to what we've seen in a direct comparison to an association's budget. The value that you receive from a reserve study is peanuts compared to what your budget is. Most associations can probably put a reserve study into their budgets, and the membership will probably not even see an impact in the fees. So again, if you haven't done that, I strongly urge you to do that. And as a tip, a reserve study also provides you the ability to really start to prepare your preventative maintenance if you don't have one. Within your reserve study, it should outline all the components that have a useful life on average between 5 to 10 plus years. So that'll let you know, many times you don't factor a preventative program for something as simple as, let's say, a pool pump or whatever may need to be done. you want to be able to, at least now you know what all your components are. And from there, you could check in with your team and see what's being done to properly maintain those equipment. So again, you're getting a lot of value from a reserve study. Again, we have no interest here in you having one, but we see the value of you getting one as a board of directors. So Stephen, I want to address here another question that I have from Helen, and she asked, can a board demand owners to hire their own licensed electrician to check their own unit and sign off for the 40-year recertification?
It depends on what components we're talking about. So if it's like the circuit breaker in the unit, I think the association has a right to require certain high-risk components to be replaced if they represent a threat to the common elements or to life safety in the building. So requiring a unit owner to hire a licensed electrician to have their own unit inspected, I think there would need to be a reason. There'd have to be some reason to trigger that request. So if we're talking about a building that's X years old, we might, as an association, go into the units and inspect the circuit breaker panel or certain other things in the unit. And then at that point say, if you need to have somebody tell us that's a professional that this doesn't need to be replaced, because from our perspective, it may need to be. So.
Yeah, I would, from the sounds of it, as Stephen said, to add to that is, it sounds like you're going through your 40-year and there's the inspection that needs to be done, which is typically the inspection to see if you have ground fault interrupters, GFIs installed. It's going to be much more cost effective for the association and also less labor intensive if you're having everyone do their own. Sorry, if you're doing it on your own as an association, rather than having every single owner go through their own process. I can understand that you're trying to save some money here and there, but it's going to be much more cost effective if you just coordinate an inspection, do what you need to do, understand your current position, and then fix whatever you need to fix. You're going to find yourself in a very difficult situation if you do it individually. It's going to be much more challenging logistically, as well as getting the issue resolved. I have a question here, Stephen, from Susan. I guess it had to do with putting together a committee. She asked, is there anything owners can do to participate in the budget process if the treasurer refuses to allow a finance or budget committee? The same treasurer has been around, I guess, since 1975 and refuses to have a committee or a majority of the board to help in that practice.
Well, there's two things about that. Number one, if any officer is creating a roadblock to the operation of the association, the other directors may remove that officer from their position. That's number one. Number two, the appointment of committees is typically within the purview of either the majority of the board or in some instances, the president. So I'm not sure the treasurer is in a position to block the creation of a finance committee. And ultimately, while the treasurer may be the one responsible to prepare the budget to recommend to the board, it's the board that has to vote on that budget. So it sounds like there's just a misconception as to the role and authority of the treasurer versus the rest of the directors there.
Correct. And I would agree if the person is just not, allowing it, you got to understand why. But either way, again, these positions are up to vote either every year or every 2 years, depending on your documents. If you're not happy with the way that things are being managed, remember, that's not the way that it has to be. You can host an election and take whatever direction you may want to take in order to either run for the board or take that seat. I have a question here when it comes to the pooling of reserves. If pool reserves, the calculation is by line item. Okay, so in the pooled reserves, is it just by line item or is it just pooled for all the items within the association?
You still have to look at the estimated useful life of the component and the remaining useful life. But the difference between the straight line funding and the pooled funding is you're funding in a pooled scenario all of the items that are in the pool. You may not have all of your reserve items in the pool. You may want to isolate, one item or two from the rest, and that's even something they're looking at in these bills that are pending. But The pooled method of funding reserves is done on a cash flow basis, meaning money's coming in, money's coming out each year, versus funding each line item individually. So if you've got 20 reserve components in your association and you're funding each component separately, you've got 20 reserve accounts on your financial statements. And how much money is in the account for roofing, you have to use that money for roofing. I can't use the money I have reserved for roofing for concrete restoration. If it's in the pool, I can use the money in the pool for any of the items in the pool when it becomes necessary to make the repair or replacement or whatever the case is. So those are the differences. Hopefully I answered that question.
Yeah, and I also find that it is common practice, because we do get that question a lot. Is it better to have straight line or pooled? In our humble opinion, I like the pooled method just because it gives us the flexibility. If one thing happens in somewhere else and we're a little bit short, we can use those monies. Now, again, that all depends on each association's different. Some associations want to have a little bit more control over what their board can and can't do, and they have to get the ownership involved. Because if you do have a straight line method, as Stephen mentioned, you can only use the roof for the roof. And if you're going to borrow one from the other, you're going to need a membership vote in order to do so. So again, a lot of it really depends on the association itself, but it is common practice, at least from the properties we've managed, is that you'll find the pool method more common throughout than the straight line method. We have had the question in the past, can I go from straight line to pooled? Yes, you can. However, what's in the straight line needs to stay in the straight line unless you take a membership vote and you decide that the membership will decide that it's all pooled. Whichever route you're going to take, I strongly urge you to contact the attorney, get the legal opinion on what the steps that should be followed to properly do that, so that you can document it and avoid any issues in the near future. I have a question here from James. James asked, what's a good resource to find qualified firms to perform the reserve study? James, I'll be happy to share several vendors that we've worked with in the past and we've had good experiences. So feel free to either email myself or Ashley, and we'll be glad to provide you that information. Let me see if we have any other questions here that we can address before we wrap up. Okay, I have here from John, Stephen. It says, our management changed our maintenance fee due date and late fees. According to the documents, the fees are due on the 10th and now they're due on the 17th, with late fees in our document stating 0.5% on the late balance, now changed to $10. Can the board do this?
I think the short answer is no. The documents control when payments are due and what late fee can be charged, subject to the statute, which is if your documents authorize a late fee, then the most you can charge is $25 or 5% of the installment, whichever is greater. If there is a specific amount stated in your documents that are less than what the statute provides for, you got to go by the amount that's in the documents. So those are things that management cannot unilaterally change, or the board can unilaterally change. That requires a membership vote. Okay,
excellent. All right, and I wanted to ask Stephen also, when it comes to the reserves themselves, is there anything that you see that's going to change or that's being proposed from the legislators at the moment that's going to change the way the reserves are done or the percentages that may be required?
Well, I definitely think we can expect a change in terms of who may do reserve studies. And, as you were saying earlier, Raphael, I think we're looking at, minimum requirements being that of, an engineer or, perhaps an architect, or maybe CPAs being the only licensed professionals who will be allowed to do reserve studies. There's talk about requiring separate reserve accounts for waterproofing, roof and balcony maintenance, and other, structural standards. So, it remains to be seen as to how the final legislation is going to look in terms of what the reserve requirements are going to be, whether we've got to carve out certain accounts that can't be touched. As we've been talking about, maybe you won't be able to include certain line items in the pool. You're going to have to separately fund them so that there's a assurance that there's enough money in that account to meet the requirements for that work to be done down the road. But that seems to be where things are headed. Things, in the short term aren't going to get cheaper. I think one of the things we'll see in the reserve studies is the inflation factor is going to be increased. I mean, most of the reserve studies I see, have a 3%, increase for inflation over a 30-year study. I don't think we're going to see that 3% anymore.
Yeah.
The number's going to go up.
Yep.
It's not funny, but it's, it's the reality. And I wouldn't be surprised if we start seeing 5-6% inflation factors in reserve studies.
Correct. And you mentioned the point of inflation, but also I want to add to that is just the pure demand. With so many condos that have gone, years, again, of either lack of maintenance, not all, but most have gone to either lack of maintenance or holding off on projects just because, and they didn't have the proper reserves or they didn't want to make the difficult decisions. Demand on its own is going to increase costs, I believe, even more than what we're seeing on the CPI side. We're finding it very difficult at this time to be able to negotiate as we used to be able to on construction projects and larger projects, just because the demand is there. Also, the costs have gone up when it comes to staffing and so forth. So overall, if the budget season is gone, but in reality, it's right around the corner again, and a lot of these things need to start to being factored, and it should be communicated to your residents. Overall, many associations in South Florida are have residents that are on fixed income, and unfortunately, I think those are the ones that are going to be the hardest impacted. It is the situation that it is, and I know it's difficult decisions that our board members have to take. But the reality is that you need to do what's right for the building. It's your fiduciary responsibility. I have a question here from Mr. Name, but she's basically asking, what's the statute that states that they don't have to present the waiving of reserves? I don't know if we could provide the specific.
Yeah, no.
Yes. It was for HOA.
For HOA.
Oh, you answered. No wonder to see it.
Okay. Yeah. 720-3036 deals with homeowner association budgets and reserves. And then for condominiums, it's 718-112. And where there's the mandatory requirement to adopt a budget fully funding reserves. And I don't remember off the top of my head for co-ops. I know that's 719. I think it's one of them. Don't hold me to that.
Yeah. I wasn't expecting you to know the exact number. You showed off there knowing already the HOA one. And I have a question here from Ken. He basically asked do we believe that the legislators will require reserve studies instead of the boards just arbitrarily deciding whether to do it or not?
Yeah, no, I definitely think for condominiums and co-ops, we're going to see mandatory reserve studies. We're going to see mandatory. The question is going to be how frequent and who can do them. And I think we're going to see that it's going to be mandated that licensed engineers or architects perform those studies. And I think we can expect to see a 3-year requirement. The big question for us is, what are they going to do to the changing of waiving reserves? Are they going to change the vote required to do that? Because right now for condominiums and co-ops, it's a majority of the membership. They may change that number to make it harder to waive reserves, or they may to try and balance the various different interests here. Because as you were pointing out, Raphael, we've got people on fixed incomes. We have an older population in Florida that this is gonna hurt. So they may decide, okay, let's identify the most critical components. Let's take those out of the mix. We won't allow those to be waived, but the other ones will give the owners the flexibility to address. There's a number of different combinations that could happen here. I think the point is start preparing for the fact that it's going to get more difficult to not fully fund your reserves. And, again, like I said, private sector reacts faster than government. Private sector doesn't have to bow to the various different special interests. They, like you said, they care about the bottom line.
Yeah.
Lenders are going to make it extremely hard to get a loan if you're not funding your reserves.
Correct. And to add to that is you'll see buyers are also getting smarter as well. After what occurred, the media has been on the situation itself. So buyers are getting smarter, asking better questions. If they're not, their lenders are. So that will get to the buyer one way or another. So the right thing to do, is to, stage it out, whether our legislators pass a bill or not. At the end of the day, as a board member, I'm sure you purchased into that unit to be able to develop equity, increase the value of your return of your investment. So one of the ways of doing that is making your building marketable, and making it marketable has much to do with not just maintaining the building, but also making sure that the building has the necessary funds, so that when it's presented to a potential buyer, they're looking at the building and saying, okay, well, they have proper funds, or at least they have reserves. They've done the proper maintenance, then yeah, you know what, this is going to be a good product for me to potentially, or a good investment for me to purchase. We're seeing it from realtors asking more questions. Before it was just give me this, give me that, let's close. Now they're taking care of their clients much more, because people are much more aware of the challenges that can arise if a property doesn't have the proper funding. So with that, we're coming up at the end of the hour. I wanted to, Stephen, ask you if there's any last tips or any last suggestions that you have for our listeners when it comes to reserve studies, or their fiduciary responsibilities.
I think the message is be proactive and communicate with your membership. If we're communicating along the way as we're doing these things, it won't come as such a shock. Now, we can't help with the people who tune out and just don't listen, but at least we can say, hey, look, we held these meetings, we communicated this information, you chose not to come, that's not our problem. But I think make that effort to communicate and be proactive. And I think the membership will respect the hard choices that as board members you have to make, even if you don't like having to make them. And that's really, I think, the overriding message.
Correct. And to add to that, I would agree with Stephen. These webinars have been going on for a long time. COVID accelerated them. So now the information is out there much quicker. But unfortunately, as Stephen said, some people just don't listen. But either way, there are changes coming. Things are going to get more expensive. It's important that you understand it. For those of you that are here, thank you very much for being here. It really says a lot about you and the leadership that you have for your community, and that you're wanting to gain additional knowledge. Just make sure to forward this information to the rest of your board members. We will be posting this on our YouTube channel, and we'll share it. I'm sure Stephen and his firm will share it with Katie. Wanted to thank you all for being here. We weren't able to get to all the questions, but you can feel free to reach out to Katie or Ashley, and we'll be happy to answer all your questions. I wanted to thank Katie, that's behind the scenes and helped put this together, as well as Ashley. And we look forward to seeing everyone at our next webinar.
Thank you for having us, Raphael. We always love participating in these education seminars. So thank you. Appreciate it.
No problem. Thank you, Stephen. Everyone have a great day. Bye-bye.